this is lively. Right, I think we start. So thanks everyone for coming. I'm Slade, the researcher for Lanchester Gallery Projects. And this afternoon's talk is a final event to take place for the occasion of Jeffrey Charles Henry Peacock's exhibition, Critical Decor, What Works. Previous to this, we've held 3 critical bouts led by Michael Hampton, Alex Bowen, and Linda Morris, who finished it off last night. And I think the framing of these critical bouts really, not really, sort of even slightly, which was good enough, set them apart from the usual polite sort of complicity which exists between actors in the art world. And I think a big thing to come from these sessions was absolutely the reliance that the art system has on this sort of hermetic compliance for the maintenance of sort of the status quo of arts. Anyway, this afternoon I can sort of drop on my artificial fighting language because today's talk will be taken by Terry Atkinson, who from the early 60s has sustained a sort of very formidable critique against the prevailing ideologies of the art system, and in particular the distortion that the market has had on sort of the whole apparatus, including, importantly, education in our art school gallery. So Terry's had a very long exchange, an ongoing exchange with the artist Jeffrey Charles Henry Peacock. And the latest output of this is his essay, Exhibition and Exposition, which breaks down his response into the chapters Exhibitionism, Stockholm Syndrome, Shift Work, and Referencing, Excuse, and Exhibiting. So Terry this afternoon is going to elaborate on this essay and sort of the wider concerns of the exhibition of Jeffrey Charles Henry Peacock and Critical Decor, What Works. And it really just leaves me to say, first of all, thank you very much to Terry for doing this, and I feel very privileged that Terry's here sort of in the closing week of LGP. And also thanks to Jeffrey Charles Henry Peacock, because they've brought, I couldn't have welcomed a better end to my LGP programme, just because it brings sort of every cynicism I've had with what I've been doing with LGP right into my office and right into the gallery space. So it's been an entirely sort of welcome end to LGP. So just to hand over to Terry, and thank you all again.
Thank you. Just an opening shot. Last time I did anything public here was a couple of years ago, when I did an exchange with a joint exchange with Owen Hatherley, and the guy I shared the exchange with was David Bainbridge, who died last June. Big loss for me. I'd known him since 1958. He's probably my oldest friend, one of the founders of Art and Language, a very loyal friend. So this is the dedication to Dave, and it's put out in the spirit of, hopefully, the ongoing inquiry he always promoted and modelled. So, I begin with an attempt to set the specific issue of concern of this talk in a broad socio-political frame by setting out 2 brief scenarios, one widely political, the other one more personal. Let us call this issue, for now anyway, whether an exhibition can be used as a critique of exhibiting without the task itself appearing to be illogical. First, on the wider level, I take the main characteristic of the system we live in Western democracies to be that of capitalist accumulation, and that this system is now driven relentlessly by a grouping of what I call the corporate tyranny The term is not an original term of mine. I copy it from Noam Chomsky. And although the precursor formations of today's corporate tyranny were formed and activated immediately after World War II, for my purposes here it is worth noting that since especially the 1970s, the corporate tyranny has been much more concerned with the advancement of finance capital rather than industrial capital. It has subordinated the requirements of industrial capital to those of finance capital. And it is also worth remembering that one of the main mechanisms through which finance capital has gained its dominant or hegemonic position in Western democracies is that of accumulation through dispossession and on a global scale. Thus, in this pattern of development of corporate tyranny, the corporate tyranny is not simply a financial elite, which just as significantly it has come to dominate the legislative elites, the elected governments of, in our own case here, in the transatlantic world, the Western countries. We can roughly characterize the main players of the corporate tyranny as some such as the Party of Wall Street, the caucus of the City of London and the European bourses such as Frankfurt, Paris and Zurich, and the lobbyists of global megacorporations. In gaining this dominant position of control and influence in Western societies, the corporate tyranny has also become, through its increasing financial hold on them, a dominant player in presiding over and regulating cultural institutions. The institution I'm going to try and say more about in the context of remarking on this exhibition, Cultural Decor, is the institution of the avant-garde, more particularly the corporate tyranny's control of what I call the avant-garde model of the artistic subject, which I abbreviate to the acronym AGMOS. Second, on a less broad and more personal level, my entire formal education program through which I passed during the period 1945-64 was a manifestation of the arrangements of what is called the Bretton Woods Accord. In my case, this was what then was called primary and junior school, 1945-50, grammar school, 1950-58, and art school, 1958-64. I have not the time here to detail out a thorough exposition of the history of the Bretton Woods Accord, except to state that this was an international agreement set up in 1944, which was concerned with the kind of public policy it was thought that capitalism should develop post-World War II. Two of the main architects of the agreement were Harry Dexter White for the United States and John Maynard Keynes for the United Kingdom. The Bretton Woods Accord was the predominant financial arrangement of British public policy, including education, during the period I attended the above-mentioned type of schools. All my education was free. In my case, courtesy of grants from what was then called the West Riding Education Authority. I note here this latter point to mark a contrast between my financial passage through art school and that of many, perhaps most, art students today. The Bretton Woods Accord remained more or less intact until Richard Nixon in 1971 initiated the major break in it when what is now called the Nixon shock was enacted. What this enactment comprised was that Nixon unilaterally cancelled the direct convertibility of the US dollar into gold. This enactment was a considerable achievement of the corporate tyranny lobby against the Bretton Woods Accord, which had insistently been conducted during the prior 25 years since the end of World War II. One of the primary aims of the corporate tyranny lobby was to subject all public services to increasing privatisation, not least education. And the increasing privatisation of education is one of the most important instruments through which the corporate tyranny controls and regulates cultural institutions, not least art school education. And through this regulation of art school education, the corporate tyranny increasingly directs and influences the character of the avant-garde model of the artistic subject. So, to focus for a minute on the exhibition, I'm going to endeavour to construct a brief analysis of two sets of relations. These relations I take to constitute both the act of art practice and the exposure and distribution of the products of that practice. These are the sets of relations. 1, the relation between exhibitionism and avant-gardism. 2, the relation between practice and career. It is number 1, the relation between exhibition and avant-gardism, which I shall attempt to mostly deal with here. I attempted to state what I mean by the term exhibitionism in a short section from an essay titled Exhibition and Exposition that I wrote for the publication Critical Decor, which is part of this exhibition. I quote the relevant passage thus: "The main target of the exhibition is itself the event of exhibiting, what might be called some such as exhibitionism. The whole organum seems to rest on the question, why exhibit? Since the event of the exhibition is the standard procedure for artists to expose their work and is therefore a critical part of the relations of distribution, hereafter ROD, it seems to be a dominant force on many, probably most artist relations of production, hereafter ROP. Thus, a second question, how significant an influence is the exhibitionism upon the ROP? It is perhaps worth pointing out that in a list of the stream of 20th century artisms, say Cubism, Constructivism, Conceptualism, etc., then just formulating that exhibitionism is a problem seems to indicate that this particular ism is not of quite the same character as Cubism, etc., since it belongs to a different kind of logical category. Exhibitionism seems less positive of housing any pictorial strategy and is therefore more dissonant in respect to the regular career gradient of many contemporary artists. In the case of the term avant-gardism, I hold it to be the act of a certain prominent form, perhaps the dominant form, of the 20th century model of the artistic subject. A form of the artistic subject I call the avant-garde model of the artistic subject, which, as I said, I shortened to the acronym AGMOS. In 20th century art world talk, this model of the artistic subject was taken to be the producer of what was called advanced or progressive art practice. It seems it continues to be thought similarly of in this way in the 21st century art world. Thus, in the context of considering further the institutionalization of the AGMOS, it seems to me that one of the main aims of this exhibition is to focus on the role of the event of exhibiting in the construction of this current model of the artistic subject. So, keeping the foregoing quote in mind, the following 6 points, starting by repeating the 2 sets of relations above, 1 and 2. 1, the relations between exhibitionism and avant-gardism. 2, the relations between practice and career. And then following, the reminders that 3, exhibitionism is not a necessary condition of making a practice, a truism. 4, exhibitionism is not a sufficient condition of having a career, successful or not, which ought to remind us to pose the question that is there such a thing as an unsuccessful career? Which question suggests that we might also need to establish a definition of what does and what does not constitute a career. And linked, a question asked in a purely rhetorical sense, is it possible to have a career without having a practice? Which will at some point require 6, the task of defining what constitutes or does not constitute a practice and what does or does not constitute a career. The above can perhaps be used to further focus if, for example, it is considered in the light of the emergence, especially since the 1960s, of what can be called the complex and expanded character of art production. I'll say a little bit more of that a little bit further on. This is the matter of how the notion of practice is assigned quality, how it is decided that such and such an example of work is considered good practice, and another example is decided to be bad practice. The decisions which assign positions between these poles of good and bad practice are the endless variations of less good practice and less bad practice until these 2 measures meet, let us say somewhere in the middle. The matter of evaluating the procedures by which art is assigned quality inevitably, I guess, also raises the issue of the procedures used in deciding what is and what is not art. For instance, to again point the matter into a historical and this time very local context, some of the projects that were formed in a little cafe here right across the road in the 1966-67 period in art and language. Michael Baldwin and I used a little cafe here to put together a number of those early art and language projects, all of which at that time were frequently considered not to be bad practice, but to be not practice at all, not art at all. And linked to it was a certain series of objective qualities about what was the geography of making art, what real estate commitments were required. Certainly, all those early art and language projects, for example, didn't require a studio. Hence, they were made on a small table in a cafe across the road, because the medium through which they were formed was that of text. So all you needed was a biro or a pencil and a piece of paper. And you didn't need a big Amish Kapoor studio to sort that out. That fact in itself, the real estate factor, as I call it, was one of the reasons we were constantly being accused of not being artists. In one sense, it was an important issue. In another sense, it didn't matter. We weren't really interested in whether we were artists, good or bad. What we were interested in is whether we thought we were interesting. The work, or whether, to put it perhaps a little bit more accurately, whether the work we were doing was or was not interesting, regardless of whether it was or not art. All the components of this exhibition, the ensemble of texts, dialogues, recordings, distributed poster text, and the other sundry objects comprising it, seem to me to raise either directly or indirectly all the topics so far touched upon in the foregoing remarks. Perhaps these components of the exhibition will come up for examination in more detail in later discussion here. Despite the periodic outbursts of what we might call populist incredulity and often outrage to what has been considered to be advanced practice during the 20th century, for example, the reaction in the 70s to Carl Andrea's brick sculptures at the Tate, avant-gardism has generally been equated with what above I have called advanced or progressive art practice. It is a case where the French term is literally translated and adopted in English as standing for something like advanced practice. I am arguing that avant-gardism is now part of the institutionalized cultural framework of Western capitalist societies, and as such is transmitted globally. That is to say, although we might say that avant-gardism was certainly in the first half of the 20th century, more or less exclusively centred on what were called Western democracies, remembering that at that time, for the last 5 or 6 years of the first half of the 20th century, the Cold War was being built up. Nevertheless, I think it's internationalism, so to speak, global internationalism speaks for itself today. It's certainly not an exclusive activity carried out in Western democracies. If you looked at the list of biennales, you can get a good picture of the geography of it. The last biennale I exhibited in was in Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates. It was an exercise in Western avant-gardism, heavily implanted in what was a heavily oil-rich funded Muslim culture. And as such, it was interesting and also disconcerting. So, although I'm arguing that avant-gardism is now part of the institutionalised cultural framework of Western capitalist societies, I'm also arguing that the Western capitalist societies are not the exclusive forum of that institutionalisation. I'm saying it's global, it's international. There are biennales of avant-gardism in Rio de Janeiro, Tokyo, Sydney, etc., etc. You can list them off. There's two or three new ones seem to break out every year. It's like museums of modern art. Since the managers and grandees of this institutionalisation continue to judge avant-gardism as advanced art, then this in turn seems to generate what might be called a perceptual paradox. We might characterise it as some such as an institutionalisation of anti-institutionalisation. Thus, returning to one of the opening points made in these remarks, I am arguing that the Agmos is now, in this sense, an important cultural vehicle contributing to the act of capitalist accumulation. So a further question immediately emerges. Can an ongoing, as distinct from, let us say, fixed, advanced art practice count as an establishment institution? Which then raises the matter, or the question, does not placing together the terms fixed and advanced seem to hint that there is a contradiction somewhere in this statement? Keeping the foregoing in mind, then, consider the following chunk lifted from David Harvey's book, The Enigma of Capitalism. Quote, wholly new mechanisms of accumulation by dispossession have opened up. The emphasis upon intellectual property rights in the World Trade Organization negotiations point to ways in which the patenting and licensing of genetic materials, seed plasmas, and all manner of other products can now be used against whole populations whose practices have played a crucial role in the development of those materials. Biopiracy is rampant, and the pillaging of the world's stockpile of genetic resources is well underway, to the benefit of the pharmaceutical companies. The transformation of cultures, histories, and intellectual creativity into commodities for sale entails dispossession, both past and present, of human creativity. Pop music is notorious for the appropriation and exploitation of grassroots culture and creativity. The monetary losses for the creators involved are, unfortunately, by no means the end of the story. Disruptions of social networks and destruction of social solidarities can be every bit as serious. Loss of social relations is impossible to recompense with money payment. End of quote. That's from the Kindle edition, 61%. Embedded as we are in the Western art world within the institutionalized framework of the corporate tyranny's version of avant-gardism, it is perhaps hard to even consider the possibility of a world without the social relations of the corporate tyranny's institutional avant-gardism. And glimpses of events that have avoided avant-gardism or tried to discard avant-gardism, for those who think art has in its earlier days a different and better version of avant-gardism, who also think that it might be possible to have an avant-gardism that contributes to a society attempting to achieve a more egalitarian distribution of wealth rather than one which is directly active in the exploit of capitalist accumulation. There is no illusion that we should undertake a return to the older, better form. A new form of avant-gardism will have to be made. This is a difficult event to conceive, and to me there is no consolation in talking of a social formation that discards the notion of avant-garde art practice. Movements that have discarded in one way or another the concept of the avant-garde may very well be worthy, but I am not at all sure that in the historical long run they can satisfy and fulfill the fundamental species requirement of the sustaining and pursuit of intellectual curiosity. A little later on, from the section I have already quoted from David Harvey, he writes concerning the Zapatista movement in Mexico that has challenged capitalist accumulation by dispossession. That is, it hasn't challenged capitalist accumulation by dispossession, It has challenged capitalist accumulation by dispossession. In other words, the challenge is not the dispossession. The challenge is the capitalist accumulation by dispossession. Large parts of whose social programs, that is the Zapatista movement, I have no reservation about at all. The movement has been brought to fairly wide media attention since the 1990s. The cultural impetus of the movement rests primarily on a fairly conservative protection of Mayan cultural forms, and this part of the social program I'm a little bit more uneasy about. In some respects, the notion of protecting an indigenous culture runs counter to what I take to be the concept of the avant-garde. There is a sense in which the 20th century concept of the avant-garde, which was built around, let's say, movements like Cubism and Constructivism, can now almost be considered an indigenous culture, hence its institutionalization. Anyway, here's what Harvey writes of the Zapatistas. Movements against dispossession of both sorts are widespread but inchoate, both geographically and in their organizing principles and political objectives. They often exhibit internal contradictions, as, for example, when indigenous populations claim back rights in areas that environmental groups regard as crucial to protect biodiversity. And partly because of the distinctive geographical conditions that give rise to such movements, their political orientation and modes of organization also differ markedly. The Zapatista rebels in Mexico, frustrated by the loss of control over their own lands and local resources and the lack of respect for their cultural history, did not seek to take over state power or accomplish a political revolution. They sought instead to work through the whole of civil society in a more open and fluid search for alternatives that would look to answer to their specific needs as a cultural formation and to restore their own sense of dignity and self-respect. The movement avoided avant-gardism and refused to take on the role of a political party, seeking to form a political power bloc in which indigenous cultures would be central rather than peripheral to political power arrangements. That last sentence, it seems to me, could be almost applied to the present day status and position of the notion of the avant-garde. The matter of cultural constraint is a far from straightforward issue to analyse. To more precisely focus on why this talk is taking place, the event of JCHP's exhibition, consider the following from JCHP's text, the distributed poster text, July 2013 to January 2014, in the publication Critical Decor, What Works, but which I have altered slightly. Let us assume here that JCHP's use in the section from which I quote below of the term productive force does not carry the metaphysical baggage that a term like life force or some such as creative force often does, but means something like the motive for producing. Thus the quote with my alteration now reads, "Consider that exhibitionism constrains the motive for producing, that the condition of studio production is hamstrung by the relations of distribution of art. Every art-like object appears to have been produced for its potential future exhibition. Everything produced in the studio fits the shape of some predestined commodity life. This pervasive exhibitionism is the result of the ownership of the means of production being controlled beyond any reasonable boundary of the producer." There's quite a lot to consider in this passage. For example, is JCHP suggesting that only constraints generated by exhibitionism are ipso facto undesirable? That is, that exhibitionism generates the wrong kind of constraints. If so, this seems to imply that exhibitionism could be productive if another set of constraints is in place. Or is it that exhibitionism is itself the constraint, and in order to be released from these particular constraints, some alternative to exhibitionism will have to be constructed? Or is this JCHP subscribing, albeit more or less unwittingly, to the deeply held art world view that creativity, whatever it might be, assumes its most potent, powerful and rewarding expression when it is unconstrained, when it has no constraints upon it at all? The latter is, rhetorical at least, a pretty widely held art world view. Nearly there. When used in respect of characterising art production, an artist for that matter, then the use of terms like challenging and radical frequently rest upon what I take to be this comfortable but misleading assumption. And following the JCHP text down in the above quote, another concept that might warrant further inquiry is that of reasonable boundary, not least since the notion of boundary itself suggests some kind of constraint. We would need to discuss perhaps what amounts to a reasonable constraint. According to the art school romantic rhetoric version of avant-gardism, then avant-gardism has generally been more associated with acting in an unconstrained environment rather than one in which boundaries are observed. My view is that the culture of the corporate tyranny, the corporate tyranny promotes has a very precise boundary, that of preserving the facility of capitalist accumulation by dispossession, which brings me back to my uneasy but committed sympathy for the Zapatista movement. So, I thought I'd leave it there. I did actually write 2 or 3 more pages, but I was getting bored with myself, I think. So do we want to talk about this, or have we finished?
I think let people respond. Further questions?
Terry, I found myself going back to Donald Drew Egbert's book, being a bit of a historian, therefore looking outside the 20th century and outside American influence since 45 on European culture. And going back to Egbert, who is a Princeton professor, but his thesis of social radicalism in the arts in Western Europe, and he goes from the French Revolution through to 1968, and he's looking very widely across Western Europe and the various. And the picture that comes out of his book is the original definition of the term avant-garde is after wars.
After wars?
After wars. But it's a reaction of decent young people to the chaos that's been caused in their societies by wars. And so I've come to see the whole kind of picture of Cubism through to conceptualism as a post-war American model, which doesn't deal with meanings and subject matter in terms of that anti-war position. You know, your work, for instance, with the First World War fits, I think, very well into that Egbert concept of what the avant-garde is actually about. And that's made me kind of concentrate a lot more on artists who've taken very strong positions against the wars that their own country have been part of. And that's also made me very, very conscious of the way in which there's almost no protest in our culture about the 12 years that we've been fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. You know, there's no way in which anyone can kind of say anything against it. But the idea that began to form for me, and still talking with students in an art school, was that the introduction of student fees by the Labour, Tory, and the way in which the student fees that they're having to pay has gone from, you know, the way in which we were paid for and received grants on top of that, through to 1,000, 3,000, 9,000. And that this parallels the period of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the introduction of this and the increase. And looking online at various sort of points, one discovers that the government's funding of wars is something like 49 million a year goes to the Army Navy, billion a year goes to the Army Navy and Air Force. but they've started a completely separate, independent fund, which started out at £1.5 billion and is now something like 57 billion a year to fight those wars. You can't a kind of parallel there between the introduction of student grants as perhaps student fees as perhaps being one of the sources of funding that the government's been able to ratchet up to pay for those wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I just wonder whether they're useful for us.
None of that would surprise me. I mean, the percentage is 3%. Wall Street regularly points out that capitalism is not successful unless there's a compound interest of 3%. So whatever happens, that has to be at least aimed for. In years like 2008 to 2011, it was well below 3%, and then we've got what is known as a crisis or whatever, depression. But in terms of money, how money is distributed to this project, let's say defence, or there is no Ministry of Attack. Usually defence means attack in terms of, let's say, Afghanistan or Iraq. And what are the monies they're spending on cultural projects? I haven't really got solid figures on it. It certainly would be interesting. First, you'd have to define what a cultural project is and what an attack project is, a defence project is. But assuming we could do that, then I think if you took somewhere like Abu Dhabi, then they're spending immense amounts of money on cultural projects. Whether they're avant-garde projects is something else. The one I had in mind was the one where Frank Gehry has been commissioned to build a museum of modern art in Abu Dhabi, an immense amount of money. And that the conditions of labourers building not just the Museum of Modern Art, but that whole project, it's called Happiness Island. I've been subject to a Human Rights Watch.
Oh yeah, because of the Southeast Asia.
Which is largely southern labour from Kerala, from southern India. And the first thing they did when they arrived in Abu Dhabi was take their passports away from them. So they had no freedom of movement. There's been all sorts of United Nations confrontations and exchanges on it. But it was an extremely direct example of the relationship between what I'm calling avant-gardism here. Nothing could be, in a sense, more institutional avant-garde than the Gehry Museum of Modern Art. Bilbao was perhaps the most iconic object of what I'm talking about here. Then I think you can see the interrelations, and maybe that's a bit nearer the picture you're talking about. But on the other hand, the thing I mentioned about the pursuit of intellectual curiosity, that seems to me to be equally problematic, because, and why I picked out the Zapatistas. The Zapatistas I find very interesting. As I said, I've got immense sympathy for their social projects, but their indigenous culture defence, to my mind, doesn't necessarily promote what I'm calling the pursuit of intellectual curiosity. My notion of the avant-garde is not what I think is a gestural one, which I think is largely what fine art has done with the avant-garde, is to do, it's closer to the scientific project, it's about intellectual curiosity. I'm saying that I think fine art, or whatever we like to call it, art practice, let's call it, has not been noted the last number of years for its intellectual curiosity. has been noted for a certain notion of presentation. And maybe that's a necessary condition of it being largely pictorial. It does seem quite interesting, for example, that Saatchi, who's a master of advertising manipulation, I mean, that's how he made his money, through advertising projects, usually pictorial graphics aligned to slick one-liners in text. And advertising and fine art probably have something in common there, that the pictorial is I better be careful there. I was going to say overdeveloped. It's the wrong word. Is over-subscribed, and the textual is downgraded. That's not saying it's not used. It's used all the time, the notion of text. Labour's not working. But they're usually very simplistic, free-line. And so I think art has been vulnerable to that kind of penetration. It's probably no accident that Saatchi is in the position he's in the art world, and can exert the sort of power he has exerted, particularly in Britain. The other thing is what I've called the institutionalisation of the avant-garde. I don't know, maybe it's an inevitable historical development, but it's certainly been well documented. That book, Who Paid the Piper, was an excellent, and there's been a lot of cover of that operation. The way that the American.
It's Francis Stoner Saunders.
Yeah, I'm sorry. There's another one called Selling Free Enterprise, which is by Elizabeth Phones Wolfe, which deals with 1945, the Roosevelt New Deal, which had largely socialised, that's not to say it made them socialist, but it largely socialised the conditions of labour in the United States inside the war effort. The Manhattan Project would be a classic case of it. It was, although there were significant private funds went into it, it was largely federal funds, it was largely government funds, public funds. As soon as the war had finished, the American corporate culture immediately started a lobby, a strong lobby, to push back a lot of the Rooseveltian New Deal operations. And by 1951, they'd achieved quite a number of it. As I said, it wasn't really completed till Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard. But the Bretton Woods Accord was Keynesian. It was John Milton Keynes' notion that the significant industries like the education industry, for instance, should remain as an instrument of the public purse, of what in the 1660s would have been called the Commonwealth. I started noticing it really in terms of symptoms when I started seeing degree shows in art schools, particularly in the early 90s. I saw an entire degree show in Leeds, where the front operation of the show was a business card. The painters were behind it, but here was the business card, here was the contact numbers. I mean, in our day, I don't think we'd ever thought of that. Certainly in the 60s, anyway.
But when I did my thesis at the Royal College on the future of art education with art language in Coventry, Boyce in Düsseldorf, and the projects class in Nova Scotia, between 71 and 73, all three courses came to an end for different reasons. But there was this, after Vietnam, after May '68, they couldn't really begin to kind of pull the culture back, whatever levers were being pulled, until the end of the Vietnam War. And then, you know, this wonderful thing, we're not going to have conscription anymore. We're going to have a professional army, a mercenary army, you know, which is America and Britain, who've led the wars since. Always the mercenary paid army, rather than the people's army, the conscripted army. What you're talking about seemed to me to kind of reinforce that idea that we need to kind of reconstruct the idea of an avant-garde, which is to do with that shadow of wars. Your references are
it's
so
a tough
much.
one. I mean, I'm not at all sure it can be done. I'm really not sure how that would pan out. This kind of show, I think, the predicament of this kind of show is a classic, I think, a classic and relatively well-formed response to that kind of problem. And then that's where you start talking about careers and practices. As I said, obviously, it's quite possible to have a practice and not have a career. Most art students would probably fall under that category as they leave art school, assuming they continue practicing. It seems logically absurd to suggest that somebody can have a career without a practice. But I do draw a distinction between the two. I would say that the Saatchi operation has been primarily about career, not about the promotion of practice.
I remember us all being very frightened under Thatcherism that she was going to cut the art schools. But that didn't happen. I can't remember who articulated it. I remember listening to someone talking, and they were saying, well, why would she cut them? Because it's like a safety valve in the culture. That people who want to be artists live much more cheaply, don't use so many resources as other people. They do up horrible parts of the town, take over post-industrial buildings, make them habitable again. They're really useful people in the society, and that's what's happened. They've increased vastly the number of people. When I went to Norwich, first of all, there were 30 fine art students a year, you know, and we're talking thousands.
Well, that's national.
Yeah.
That's a national phenomenon.
But then again, art schools have joined universities. Actually, art schools have pretty well disappeared and become departments in universities, and as Terry once said, they often become business courses.
That's an interesting aspect of the institutionalisation. I mean, some of the most zealous defenders of art school culture being absorbed by university, what we might call university culture. And there's a distinction should be drawn there, because university culture, even when I first started teaching at Leeds, which was a red brick university, one of the old universities, that had undergone that kind of operation. The university then wasn't a business operation, but certainly by the 90s it was a business operation, pure and simple. Education was second to fundraising, no question about it.
And in terms of art colleges disappearing, Central, St Martin's, Chelsea,
Yeah.
all gone, you know.
Yeah, well, I think that's another case of how you do it.
So she did
It's another mechanism.
Yeah.
You pull them together and absorb them in a certain way. But what I think a problem with that argument is that eventually you get down to over-defending the old art schools. And the old art schools were certainly not what I call bastions of progressive thinking. But the ones I mean, that's why I wrote the art and language thing. Although by the time the art and language thing was really going, it had just passed the cusp of going from the art school down here, which was the old art school, the Coventry School of Art as it's called, into the Polytechnic, which was this new purpose-built one here. And certainly if art and language were progressive, then, you know, that's the point worth thinking about. For me, anyway. If art and language were progressive, then it wasn't well received by the old art school system. On the contrary, it was hostilely attacked. But in terms of career, which is the thing really I think JCHP raised in this exhibition, and raised in their previous event to Canister McSharry. What we've got with art now, I think, advanced art, all this in scare quotes, advanced, less advanced, not advanced at all, Neanderthal, whatever we like to call it. What we've got there is a branding operation. And I think, again, you know, Saatchi is excellent at that.
Can I comment here? Because I think if you locate this in the present, in the notion of the avant-garde, and the values which have been absorbed culturally in the avant-garde. So when starts in the 19th century associated with the dealer system, you get the notion of the visionary, the challenging, the leading edge, and all the things which are promoted throughout industry. And today we have the Biennales, as you mentioned, which are these microcosms of those values, these wonderful things which attract thousands, hundreds of thousands of people to see them. You've got the situation which happened last summer with the Istanbul Biennale, and is happening now with Sydney and with Manifesta in St. Petersburg, in that these young artists are now being asked to boycott these Biennales. So I had a phone call on Monday from a young artist who's been selected for Sydney, but because one of the funders of Sydney has now got the contract for running an island of detainees, of people who have sought asylum in Australia and have been put on this island ready to be deported home. The company that is providing all the facilities supports the Biennale by 10%. So a group of every artist participating in Sydney this summer have been asked to withdraw in protest of this funding. What do they do? Because for a younger artist to be selected for Sydney, that is about a career.
Well, that
is about a career.
Biennales are pure career. I don't think Biennales have ever been art practice, ever.
So do they withdraw?
Well, all I can say to that is it's up to them. But I would say, yeah, they withdraw. They can withdraw, and it may feel them better, but it won't make any difference. I think the withdrawal of labour in career is toward a career is something very different from the withdrawal of labour in practice. It's if you're going to stop practicing, where the nitty-gritty will come. Because if the products are cut off, that is, if the relations of production are affected rather than the relations of distribution, then I think you will have a serious social phenomenon, in the sense that a society that's not producing art, rather than just producing and distributing it, but is not producing it, is quite a hard society to envisage. I mean, again, it will depend on where we draw the boundaries, if we draw them at all, as to what art is. I mean, can a 3-year-old produce art? And if you're going to stop the production of art, and you count 3-year-olds' production as part of art, you stop 3-year-old production. And then you've got shades of National Socialism and Stalinism emerging. So that's why I think it's tricky.
That's not what you were saying, is it? No.
What were you saying then? Should the artists... The reason why would they not withdraw? Because they wanted to promote their career.
Yeah.
Yeah, I understood that. Well, yeah, and mostly that's what they do. Most people in the past have done that, I think.
I have one comment about that, because I know I just read a letter by some artists that worked with in the past that define themselves as having a socially engaged practice, and they couldn't participate in something like that because their practice is something that is not human rights. So I guess it also might depend on the practice in this case. And in this case, that was also
did you not show with Saatchi after Hans Hacker revealed that the amount of his engagement with South Africa during apartheid? I mean, the text was circulated, even though the tape censored it. But artists didn't stop selling their work to Saatchi, did they?
It's about the politics of the avant-garde and how artists are forced to represent us, if you like. There's this new kickback, so you don't go to Sydney, then the next one is don't go to St. Petersburg because of the Russians' attitude to homosexuality. Yeah. And so there's all these now signals coming across where artists are being forced to stand for a social value.
Well,
and I find that really interesting, but also very problematic.
It's probably a good thing. We'll wait and see, but it's probably a good thing. It's certainly a good thing that people are thinking about it anyway. But when we're talking about the avant-garde and biennales, for example, this is assuming that the practices that go into biennales are avant-garde. That is our advance. That's what I was trying to do. I'm suggesting, I think I'm suggesting anyway, that over the past 40 or 50 years, much of what has been called advanced art, I have doubt that it's advanced. And part of the reason it's not advanced is because Korea over-regulates practice. Now, if the Saatchi thing's quite easy in one way to get around, you can refuse to sell to Saatchi, but Saatchi gets 5 proxy buyers in. And he may well get 2 proxy buyers who've got impeccable socialist credentials. And then they buy, and it turns out their impeccable social credentials are not so impeccable because they sell to Saatchi. I mean, the selling operation is open. It's an open field, no question about it. There are 1,000 ways to skin that cat. I mean, another on-language anecdote, we sold an index to, I'm not sure who sold it, I think it was Logsdale. I'm not even sure who sold it, which dealer it was, because we had a string of dealers at that time. And we sold it to the Shah of Iran, or Persia, as it was. And it went to Tehran. As far as I know, it's never been seen since, because in 1979, presumably, the Heavy Brigade sorted it out in no uncertain terms as to what was acceptable ideology and what wasn't. And there are interesting things for me about the indexes, regardless of the fact that they were complicit, if that's the word we're going to use, with a oppressive political regime, the Shah's regime. And I'm not saying anything about the Ayatollah. But it does show the problem, I think, that if you sell the work, in a sense, no matter who you sell it to, you can feel better about it because you've sold it, let's say, to, I don't know, the Socialist Workers' Party circa 1978. And I don't ever recall the Socialist Workers' Party buying works, but let's say that makes you feel better. Then you find that a government has come in that has frozen the Socialist Workers' Party assets and taken into possession Work X and Work Y, which has remained in the basement. I mean, that seems to me to be something you have to live with, that kind of political accident, if you like.
But Terry, on the issues of younger artists, much more difficult than when, dare I say, we left art school. I mean, there obviously was an art market, and it was Bond Street, but it just wasn't what it is now. It was dangerous as it is now. I mean, when in '68, I mean, loads of people, loads of fine art students and lecturers aboard the market. Wouldn't sell their stuff to rich people, wouldn't be the playthings of rich people. I mean, that was very clear for loads of us. But then Thatcher's children, the young British artists had no problem selling their stuff.
I don't recall the market in the early 60s wanted to grab my hand and take my works. That's the first thing. I'm not sure that the market was ever anything but basically largely comprised of private buyers. And one way we thought about it then in the 60s, I think, was that it was nice to sell to public collections. David Bainbridge had a quite straightforward policy on that. I never agreed with him because he suggested we give some of the early art language works to the Tate. Now, giving to the Tate would be a bit like giving to Tony Blair. In a sense, you can't win on any of those sorts of distinctions. What you've got to concentrate on, I think, is not the distribution, but the practice. That's why I'm saying the career is such an influence. The notion of career is such an influence now on the notion of practice. And it is because of that market you're talking about. The market has become
Pernicious.
Well, vibrant in that. And also, it was unheard of when we were art students for a collector to buy, to even intervene seriously at student level. I mean, Saatchi moved in, what was it, the class of 88, and bought practically the whole year's work. That's the way the corporate thing operates, I think.
But I have major issues with the Tate. I did the big show at Tate Liverpool of Picasso, Peace and Freedom, and it was incredibly successful, and the Tate probably made about £500,000 out of it. I did it on a grant from the AHRC, and they never even paid a hotel night for me, but be that as it may. But when I'd done the research working on Picasso's archive from the AHRC funding, I'd found out a lot of material about Picasso in Africa, and I asked would it be possible for me to publish it in this, and they wouldn't let me publish it in the same book because they'd just done the Atlantic exhibition, and they said you can do another show. And when I put the proposal into them seriously for another show, they wouldn't consider it. I was literally just passed back across the table to me. We're not able to look at that, Linda. And the background to that was that there was a 3-page article in the New York Review of Books by the Picasso scholar Richardson. And Richardson's now employed by Gagosian. And I mean, I've long watched the relationship between Sirota. I think someone could do a magnificent PhD on the career of Nick Sirota, which would be one curator, 3 museums over 4 decades and 4 dealers. The first decade was Conrad Fisher, the second decade is Anthony Dauphin, the third decade is Marion Goodman in New York, and the 4th decade is Gagosian. Now, Gagosian's invested heavily in late Picasso, and his clients are, American industrialist capitalists. And the last thing he wanted, and hasn't allowed any kind of Picasso scholars to deal with, is Picasso and communism, which Peace and Freedom completely opened up. And the pressures were such that they take just, even with a successful, important international exhibition, just wouldn't consider working with me. I've never even been asked to give a lecture at the Tate.
I walked into the Tate once. I walked into a room and there was Keith Piper, who was one of our students, right? There was Peter de Francia, Stuart Brisley, Conrad Atkinson. And I thought, what the fuck is this doing in here? Right? I mean, when that stuff was produced, the Tate never had it, and now it's the same distance.
No, that's the near of the year,
there.
Anyway.
I mean, they've never done a Terry Atkinson
Right.
or art and language show even.
Well, yeah, I don't know why. They've still never done a Terry Atkinson. That's not because I refuse. That's because I've never been offered. And it would be an interesting thing to be offered, because then, you know, I'd be up against the problem our friend raised there. You know. But I guess, I don't know, some artists as they get older, I guess, find career more important. Some artists as they get older find career less important. I certainly belong to the latter. I don't really give a fuck about a career. But I do care about the practice. It's the practice that's what interests me about JCHP. That's what interests me about a show like this. That it'll be interesting to see if they ever do get any offers, stay with the notion of offers, how they react to that. Because the offer is definitely the absorbing mechanism. That's how they absorb it. And, you know, I mentioned Chomsky. Chomsky was an early art and language input. Michael Baldwin did a thing out first time we ever heard of Chomsky in the very early days of art and language. And he's been a constant point of reference to me ever since. I think I've read most of his stuff and studied quite a lot of it in some depth. And in a sense, there's a model there of how you keep what I call intellectual curiosity intact, and at the same time have a really successful academic career. But I think it is easier with the science, i.e. linguistics. The reason he's been that MIT, he's been a professor at MIT for he's emeritus now, I suppose, professor at MIT since the 60s, is that he's an extremely powerful linguist. The science he's involved in, he's an extremely competent scientist. Artists, it can't really work like that. We don't have the objective criteria on hand for deciding whether this is, that's why I mentioned assigning quality, deciding whether this is good or this is bad. It seems to be more a kind of public consensus, and it's become increasingly, it seems to also at the same time become increasingly influenced by media exposure. I mean, the sophisticated media when we were students was the Sunday Times colour supplement, I suppose, the populist one. And you followed that, you could get a reasonable idea about pop art, for example, was developing by following the Sunday Times colour supplement. And you could probably gauge your equations for making a career from something like that. That's certainly how I worked with both those early groups that I worked with. From that kind of media exposure. But now it's immediate. What's more, the media itself is owned by the corporate tyranny. And the corporate tyranny, I don't mean just the commercial media, I mean the corporate tyranny owns, since it influences and generally controls the legislative elites, that is the elected governments, it also, in a sense, is one of the dominant forces behind the so-called public service media, the BBC, for example. It runs right across the whole system. That seems to me to be the difference between a culture that was governed by what I call the Bretton Woods Accord, and a culture that is governed by what I call the demolition of the Bretton Woods Accord.
But isn't there still that kind of possibility of integrity? And also the standing for something, the subject matter? Doesn't that...
Well, I think we haven't even touched on that. In a sense, we're probably not going to, because I'm approaching the point of exhaustion anyway. But the subject matter is an important thing here in this show, I think, and it should have been looked at in more, perhaps I should have looked at it in more detail, yeah, but it would have been a much longer paper. There's a number of pathways that is to do with Kobe, since the Kobe stone breakers is made relatively iconic in this set of resources here. There's some interesting pathways there about the avant-garde from Kobe himself. When I was talking about the old avant-garde, which I don't think we can return to, the classic avant-garde, Kobe, I'd say something like Kobe, Rambo, Lautréamont, etc. Reclaiming the Paris Commune. From that period, about 1860 to 1871, that decade, to the Paris Commune. Then the avant-garde, I think, was truly dissenting, as opposed to permitted dissent. Rambo would be a very interesting case to look at. I mean, the guy was ungovernable, and in many ways he conforms to a certain kind of anarchist model. Kobe is more specific in being anti-Salo and breaking, fashioning an alternative to Salo. But no, today, any of that stuff would be easily absorbed. There wouldn't be any problem at all. I mean, permitted dissent is the cultural item that loads notions like challenging and risk that Sirota perpetually raised at every turn of Price speech. These artists that are selected here challenge our, etc., and risk at such and such. Struck me as just purely rhetorical, all that stuff.
But you're going to a French model. This exhibition goes to a French model. I was always very affected by Frederick Antal, the Hungarian German historian here, and he was always pointing out in his articles that Britain only had a bourgeois revolution. You know, that Cromwell was really a bourgeois revolution, and we hadn't had any serious revolutionary moments since the 1640s, and that we were stuck in that position of a bourgeois culture, a bourgeois realism.
Just to stay with the French model, I mean, when I was a student, it was while I was a student. At Barnsley, it was Paris, which was the centre. When I was at Barnsley, Paris was still the centre. By the time I got to second year at Slade in 1962, the shift had gone from Paris to New York. Now, the shift from French capitalism to American capitalism strikes me as quite an interesting area to look at. Because if you looked at an outfit, you know, a bank like Lazare Frères, French bank, in New York in the 50s. There's a book on Lazare Frères which is very informative on that, and they were all collectors. But once it got to New York, it became a much more aggressive market operation, much more aggressive, once the centre moved. And in many ways, one of the primary artistic models for much of the practice of the late 20th century and in war is the marketeer par excellence. He marketed everything, including all aspects of the person. I mean, he marketed the studio as factory. He marketed all those projections of Warholism. He marketed his assistants. All that was market driven. That seemed to me to signify a certain kind of shift from the French model to the American model. At the same time that was happening was that immense expansion of what we might call literally the physical materials of art. If you look at Smithson, who by the early 70s was making things like the spiral jetty. Now the spiral jetty was funded by the Dominial Corporation. It is an actual cooperatively funded operation. That, I think, in Paris would have been a more... The resources weren't there. Once American capital was housed at the centre of the art market, then I think it became a really corporate operation, absolutely corporate. When Lehman Brothers tanked, and it's quite an interesting case, Lehman Brothers, because it was the only one that was allowed to tank. The Americans and the British all bailed out their banks. They all raided the Commonwealth in order to bail out their banks. The Museum of Modern Art became in serious trouble because Lehman Brothers provided a third of its funding. I mean, it was soon sorted out. It wouldn't have been allowed to go to the war, the Museum of Modern Art. But all those sorts of examples give I think, some indication of the state of what I've called the institution of the avant-garde. Now, if you're offered a show at the Museum of Modern Art, to get back to your place, and for, I don't know, 20 years you've been wanting, or you've been conceiving that you're the apogee of being marked out as a significant artist is something like a show at the Museum of Modern Art, then it probably would be difficult to turn it down if you're career oriented, and most of us are, one way or another, or many of us are. That most is too strong. Largely I'm putting that in because if there are a lot of artists who are purely practice minded and not career minded, we probably won't hear of them. Anyway.
I remember an interview of Leamington Spa on the Open University, questioning his selling work to Thatcher, and his work is very much about subject and very important. And he said that well, he had to live.
Yeah,
but then at what level do you?
Yeah, I didn't say that, but that's the first
How much
thing.
money do you need?
You need to live in Kensington Palace.
Quite.
And then there's, which somebody fleetingly raised, you know, what these days is called public art, the commission operation. I did a lot of work on Kapoor's sculpture in Chicago. What's it called? The big oval. I think it's called. The Chicagoans call it the beam. What's it called?
Beam, right, beam.
Yeah. And the first commission, I think, was for 4 million. It finished up costing 23 million to produce that. It was, they did some very smart Chicago news reporter did a comparative set of statistics and pointed out that it was 50 times more than the Women's Refuge Fund for Chicago, etc., etc. all that seems to me to be worth looking at, in the sense that if you looked at the operation in Birmingham has been a big, for Britain anyway, not necessarily for if it's scaled against the United States, but Birmingham has been quite a big promoter of public art. There's a lot of stuff in it. I don't know whether there's the first one I remember going in Victoria Square was that gondola, which comes out of the pavement at an angle. And my in-laws, my wife's in-laws, my wife's parents had quite an interesting reaction to that. Predictably interesting. And then various others got much bigger things got done. the Raymond Mason one, which some, as I understand it, some gang from Aston burnt down. I mean, that's Courbet-like. That's the demolition of the Vendôme column syndrome. And there's the floozy and the jacuzzi, as they call it. That's an immense budget. I think a lot of it came from government money, but it probably is government money that what I call the legislative elite. It's probably government money raised from the corporate elite. And there is a lot of corporate money in Birmingham's public art programme, a lot. So all those sorts of areas, I think, are worth looking at. There's the specific ones that are commissioned for a specific geographical space, and David Harvey goes into the notion of geography quite a lot in this book. Such as the Angel of the North, which is specific. And then there's the sculptures that are made and then are absorbed and then placed in them, which weren't actually commissioned to go in this place to finish up, but they do finish up. A lot of Henry Moore's are like that. There's one in Leeds, which wasn't made for Leeds, but it was bought by such and such a benefactor and finally placed in the public space in Leeds. I think all those things are worth looking at in relation to what we're talking about. On the other hand, are we expecting art students to have this kind of background, in which case to gather the information, it's extremely doubtful whether they're going to have time to practice anyway. And so there is a problem. There is a kind of area which I think a modern art student has to deal with, which in many ways in the 60s we never thought of.
I remember Peggy Somerville interviewing her, and she said the reason why Henry Moore had this vast career was they could go anywhere in Europe, they had all the bomb sites, and put down the Moore sculptures. You know, everything goes back to war. You know, war.
Well, yeah, well, you're in a city where much of the planning is goes with the Luftwaffe. But nevertheless, I think I've tended to talk about the corporate in this situation. I think it's important that students at least know something about it. On the other hand, we've talked very little about practice itself, about what you do in response to it, if you do anything at all. That seems to me to be a kind of crux question. And I think JCHP projects tend to try to concentrate on that. What do you do in terms of practice, in terms of an exhibition and its relationship to career and practice? And that's why, I think that's why I've had this long exchange with relatively a couple of years.
Is there, you know, you're talking about just now students not having time to kind of read up all the David Holding, but surely the art language model of the practice including teaching and the discursive aspect is a kind of, well, not a way forward because that's not how we got it, a model to use. Because I was at Wimbledon School of Art last week looking at one of the course documents that they give out as a student handbook, and all the way through it the management crossed out the word critical and replaced it with contextual. Yeah. And there are quite a few people, teaching staff, got, well, one or two people got annoyed with that. And surely that's the, you know, you've got to factor in a discursive aspect into a notion of practice. And I've got to tell you that, obviously, but that is a model for practicing it to not at all separate the discussion and the sort of things you're talking about. Because when I talk to students about things like this, and I'm sure other people do, they kind of go, oh, no one said that to me before, but the management says this. You know, they're still open to listening to.
Well, it may be. I mean, the matter of content of the practice as you said, my practice has always had, I think, insofar as it's worth anything, a significant part of its content has been digging out a critique of whatever I took effectively. But at the same time, that's what I mentioned earlier, there is a notion that the pictorial, I think, is somehow not language bound. In fact, Jonathan Mead, in that last programme on Sunday night, this programme he's been doing on brutalist architecture. No, I know 2 or 3 people here saw it. I mean, he's a demagogue, an unstoppable demagogue in his own right. But he did raise the question of the notion of language, and he talked about body language having not being a language at all. It doesn't fulfill the conditions of a language. It doesn't have grammar and syntax, etc. We just use it metaphorically. And one of the things I've often banged on about is, from day one of being in art school in Barnsley in the late 50s, what I've heard frequently throughout the 60 years is this notion of visual language, which strikes me as the same kind of non sequitur. Language has to have a grammar and a syntax. And there are ways in which we can talk about
sketching. When you do the sketch, it's body language, isn't it? Is it posture? Is it your body language?
If you look at writing, let's say, as opposed to speaking, there clearly is a sense in which writing is visual for most people, unless you've got a pathological condition like being blind or whatever, you've got to find another way. But the norm is that you have to look before you can read, but you have to know the rules for reading it, and the rules are the linguistic rules. In what order does of come? Does it make sense to come after the, or before the, or does it not make sense at all? And then there's the famous Chomsky example of how we can make kind of alliteration of poetic things of nonsense. Green ideas sleep furiously. Where it makes grammatical sense, but it doesn't make where it makes syntactical sense, but it doesn't make meaningful sense. All that, I think, is characteristic of language. So when we use the term visual language, and it's used all the time, it still is, I've always found it a very difficult thing to try and figure out exactly what does that mean. And Mead raised it quite interestingly on Sunday night. First time I've ever heard it raised on a TV culture program.
It's also a little bit like the purely visual. I remember hearing that in the 60s so much with abstract painting.
Yeah. That's just, I take that to be a synonym, purely visual. Yeah. I mean, one of the most, going back to Peter's point, one of the most frequent attacks on art language practice was that it wasn't art because it wasn't purely visual.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. And I mean,
it
used to be quite interesting to hear Michael Baldwin smart arse's way, lecture to the assembled artistic masses about philosophical fineries that was completely alien to it.
What artists do you rate? What present artists do you rate?
None of them, I mean, I don't rate in that sense.
Rate as in life.
I mean, sorry?
What artists do you love, mate? Simple question.
I like Goya.
Yeah.
I don't love him though.
What do you love?
I mean, there are a lot of artists I'm interested in, and I guess that's a way of rating it. But if I took you to mean rate by what artist do I like, which is a kind of interesting way of putting it, because that's generally one of the most familiar ways we address art. We say, I like that artist's work, and I don't like that artist's work.
Do what you like.
But like it is, again, quite a slack way, I think.
Love, mate, I said a word about the rest of myself. Like love, ideas as well, that's what I said. Oh yeah, you said it.
What about contemporary art?
Sorry?
What about the contemporary artists that you love?
I don't, none of them I love. No.
What contemporary artists do you think have integrity? Put it that way.
None of us have integrity. None of us have integrity. I mean, some of us might have. I'd take that as a kind of percentage operation. And it relates to the opportunism that you raised, whether you can afford to not to take this opportunity and afford, or whether you can afford to take that opportunity. So, some of the things I've done in selling work, for example, have not exactly been models of what I call ethical satisfaction. And we could go into that.
I'm not really, the way forgive me for rephrasing your question, but the way I see it is not about the integrity of what happens to the art, but the integrity of making the art.
Yeah, well, that's easy to deal with. I think most of the art I've made in good faith. Most of the art I've sold, whether I've sold it in good faith is another thing.
But to answer the question of the students here, which artists working today do you think have that integrity?
Well,
their practice?
JCHB have a certain amount of integrity, that's for sure, I think.
I think that's nice.
Yeah, okay.
Like,
I've had enough.